Hello and welcome to today's Ergogenic Age screencast. This is part 2 of Nutritional Ergogenic Age. Today we're going to have a look at the things highlighted down here. So we're going to have a look at basically 3 things at the top here. So we're talking about Nutritional Ergogenic Age. We need to consider the amount of food, the composition of the food we eat, and the timing of the food we eat in relation to aerobic endurance athletes and anaerobic power-based athletes. So we look at these 3 things here in relation to those 2 different types of athletes, and then finally we'll have a look at we need to have a look at our hydration. So what are the benefits of being hydrated, and if we're dehydrated, what are the disadvantages of those? And then we have to have a look at something called carbohydrate loading, which you might have heard of. So that's what we're going to look through. So let's get started then. The first thing we're going to have a look at is carbohydrate loading. Now basically, if we're going to talk about a description of this, carbohydrate refers to how you manipulate your carbohydrate intake the week before an endurance event. Now, some people, if you're an athlete, you might have heard of a pasta party, which basically is a way that long distance runners or marathon runners ensure they have enough carbohydrates before they're doing a marathon. I'll talk a bit more about that in lesson. Now, when we are manipulating carbohydrates, we have to know some certain things, and it's based around a 7-day process. So we are focusing 1 week before an event, an endurance event, let's say a marathon. How do we split up our week, and what do we have to consider? We have to consider this. We have to consider when we're going to exercise. Secondly, we need to consider what our diet is going to consist of in order to maximize our glycogen stores by the 7th day, which will be our event or marathon, as I said before. So let's have a look then. So we're going to split it up into 4 sections and start our first section. First thing we have to consider when we're carbohydrate loading is day 1 of 7. We need to do some kind of exercise to deplete glycogen stores. So the first part of it is we want to deplete the glycogen stores in the first place. Now, when we're doing that, okay, the next thing we need to focus on is days 2 and 3. So once we've depleted our glycogen stores, the next thing we have to do is have a diet that is low in carbohydrates but higher in protein and fat. So we are really now starting to cut our carbohydrates down. So low carbohydrates, high protein, and a little bit of fat in our diet. So once we've got this, that takes us to our first thing. So if you imagine your glycogen stores are depleted, we've then by doing exercise, then we deplete them further. We don't replenish them. We lower them again. Okay. Day 4 involves having another exercise session, which will deplete glycogen stores further. And at this point, your muscle and liver glycogen, your muscle and liver, I should say, are screaming for glycogen. Okay. And what happens at this point is that in days 5 to 7, we then can eat a high carbohydrate diet, and the effect of this is that it will increase our glycogen stores when we're taking part in the race. So that is the idea. It's a 7-day process. They're the key parts of that 7-day process. Now, advantages, if we do this, it can increase our glycogen stores by up to 50%. Okay, that's the first thing, which is a real positive effect on it. On top of that, of course, if we've got more glycogen, it can increase endurance or lead to increased endurance, leading to increased intensity and duration of performance when doing endurance events. On top of that, it can help us delay fatigue. So that is the way we're looking. If we use glycogen as our start trigger point, and then remember, if we've got more glycogen, that increases our endurance, which will lead to intensity and duration, which, of course, if we can run for longer, that means that fatigue has been delayed. Okay, so they're the key things we're looking at there. They are advantages. Disadvantages of this, now I'm sure you can start to see, if you're looking at the exercise that you do, the exercise in that 7-day process is relatively low intensity. Okay, you're starting to taper down your intensity. And if I said from here then, we're starting to taper it down. One of the disadvantages, if you imagine you've been doing 20-mile runs, if you're preparing for a 26-mile marathon, maybe 3 weeks ago, that suddenly you get to the week before the event and you're dropping it down to, I don't know, maybe 5 kilometers, 10-kilometer runs maximum. And you start to think that now, what are the disadvantages if suddenly you cut down your training and you massively intake your carbohydrates right at the end. Well, one of the downsides to it is that it can lead to weight gain and also can make you feel pretty lethargic, okay, lazy, can't really be bothered to do it. On top of that, it can cause gastrointestinal problems. By absolutely filling your body with glycogen, we can't always digest it. So this can cause us gastrointestinal problems. And on top of that, it can cause hypoglycemia. So when we've had a real kind of intense intake of glycogen, it can have a rebound effect that it will then lower our blood glucose, which will cause us real problems then. Okay, so there are advantages, disadvantages. Obviously, for World Anti-Doping Association, it's legal. That is not meant to be anaerobics. Just change that to aerobic. So that'll be aerobic performers, such as middle and long distance runners. So please change that one there. Okay, so hopefully we've got that in. Let's have a look at our next one. The next thing we have to have a look at then, we've looked at carbohydrate loading, glycogen on its own. Now what we have to do, there could be an exam question ask you about the amount, composition and timing of meals, and we have to then make sure we split between aerobic and anaerobic. Now aerobic is a little bit more complicated because this isn't looking at the whole week before, this is looking at right before. Okay, so there are 2 stages pre-event on the day of the event for an aerobic endurance athlete. So if you imagine, carb loading is a whole 7-day big picture of diet and exercise. When we're talking about amount, composition and time of meals, we're talking on the day a few hours before. So what do we do on the day of an event for an aerobic performer? Pre-event, split it into what? Amount and composition. Okay, so amount of foods. We need a high carbohydrate meal. For example, something complex carbohydrates, so it might be something like porridge, something slow release. And then after that, we need to now consider the timing of our meal. So we need to have this meal 2.5 to 3.5 hours before the event. So this is really, really important. So amount and composition come together. So we need a high composition of carbohydrates in our meal. The timing has to be 2.5 to 3.5 hours before when we're looking at high carbohydrate meal. Now, pre-event 2, because if that's 2.5 to 3.5 hours before event, we then need to consider what's going to happen right before the event. Okay, so when we get then pre-event 2, let's have a look. So maybe I'll go down here first. So when you get into the period of 1 to 2 hours before an event, we then need to have small snacks. Very small snacks, maybe you're looking in the hour really before the event, which you will have a simple carbohydrates, fast release, sugar-based carbohydrates. For example, an energy bar you might have right before. So if you think of it from here, 3.5 hours before, you have a complex carbohydrates, and then you're looking at an hour before, you might have an energy bar if you feel like you need it. Okay, so that's that. Hopefully then we can see why would we do this. So what you know about carbohydrate loading in a 7-day process, you will realize the reason this is done is to increase our glycogen stores. Now on top of that, during the event then, what happens during, and anyone who's done a long distance race or marathon will know that your glycogen and glucose stores will deplete relatively quickly, so often people will be handing out glucose drinks or gels just to top up your blood glucose levels as you are running through the race. On top of that, post-event. So post-event, you imagine you have absolutely smashed your glycogen and glucose stores, okay? They are depleted to their hilt. You are not carb loaded now. You're not trying to reduce it. So post-event, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to have a high carbohydrate meal in terms of the amount of carbohydrates, the composition. It's going to be high carbohydrate. You will have a little bit of protein if you want to put into there, but the main thing is to replenish those glycogen stores, and you might have some high carbohydrate and some, you might put protein meal as well if you want to put protein on top there. Now, in terms of that timing, now you would need to have this meal within 2 hours, and I think really most people who have done any of these long events, if you don't have it really within 30 minutes to 2 hours, you really start to feel that the first 30 minutes is ideal to get some carbohydrates in you, but within the first 2 hours of finishing a long distance endurance race, really important that you get them in within 2 hours. Okay, so that's the timing, that's the composition. Let's have a look at the next one then. Oh sorry, just to finish off, the whole point of that is to replenish our glycogen stores. Okay, so if we go on from there then, let's have a look at how it might differ. A lot easier this one. So now what we have to do is look at the amount, composition and timing of meals for anaerobic strength or power athletes. So if you are somebody who's doing you're a sprinter, for example, a hammer thrower, a discus thrower, a javelin thrower, if you are one of these athletes, what does that mean? Okay, so in terms of amount, composition and timing of meal. Now for these athletes, we need to have a bit more of a balance. So what we're looking for here, we're looking at 5 to 6 meals a day. And within those meals, we need to make sure, this is really important, there is 30% lean protein, which is above what you would have as a normal person. Okay, so 30% lean protein alongside complex carbohydrates and some fat intake. Okay, now, whole point of this is that we need to have glycogen stores, because remember, glycogen can be, although it's an aerobic fuel, it can also be an anaerobic fuel. And by having the protein, this means that we can grow and repair our muscles. Okay. On top of that, then, if we look at this, what happens following an anaerobic event, say an Olympic weightlifter? Okay, so if they are an Olympic weightlifter, what are they going to do after they have done an event? Well, most people would know this. You need to make sure we have a high carbohydrate and high protein meal. Now, so high carbohydrate and high protein, and people who do any kind of weight training, for example, will know when you finish weight training, that is the ultimate time to have a combination of protein and simple sugars, okay, or simple carbohydrates, because it allows you to, resynthesize those glycogen or replenish those glycogen stores, glucose stores, alongside having the protein that will allow us to grow and repair our muscles following training. So it's really important post-event. It's within 1 hour. The window of opportunity, as it's known, where people get the ultimate kind of growth of muscles and repair of muscles by using a combination of high carbohydrates and protein within. Now, often you might want to put this, in fact I probably would, if you were going to put an example of how you got this, a lot of people will use protein shakes for this post strength or power performance. So make sure you've got a protein / carbohydrate shake in there. Okay, so whole point behind it there: replenish glycogen stores, growth and repair of muscles. So first one is to increase them, this one is to replenish them, and hopefully we can see how that works. Final one then, let's have a look at hydration. Now, hydration, it's a really important part of sport. So what is hydration then? So I think the key thing here is whenever we're talking about hydration, we just got to remember that the whole point of hydration, as you can see here, is to prevent dehydration. So hydration from sports drinks and water, it can prevent symptoms of dehydration, which are really negative on performance. For example, because we are so dehydrated, our blood plasma volume decreases because the water is moved out towards the skin. Okay, we're sweating, and on top of that, that can then lead to an increased heart rate, as we will know from exercising at the heat. If you remember, it can lead to cardiovascular drift, where our heart rate goes up constantly, and it's really quite dangerous for us. Okay, so going on from there, that's an example of what hydration does. It prevents dehydration, which is dangerous because of these things, which are the disadvantages of not being hydrated. So you'll use those again in a minute. So right then, this is the key thing now. So if hydration is so important, how do we do it? Yes, we can use water, okay? But people tend to use water alongside other forms of hydration in the form of sports drinks. So what we need to know then are what the 3 types of sports drinks that people use. Why should they be using them? What are they most beneficial for? So let's have a look first up then. So how do we do it? Okay, the advantages are linked to the 3 different types of sports drinks. So starting off, you have a hypotonic drink, which is where they have low glucose in them. And this is best for just rehydrating muscles, rehydrating your muscles and body when you're doing exhaustive work. On flip on that, you've got isotonic. Now, isotonic basically has a neutral glucose balance or concentration. It's the same concentration as your blood at rest. So the glucose in your blood stays the same. So this, obviously, when you're exercising, your blood glucose drops. Okay, so isotonic drinks just allow you to top up your blood glucose to the same as they would be at rest or before exercise, and it's fantastic for rehydration and energy. And the final one is a drink called hypertonic drinks. Now, hypertonic, you think of hyper, if you're going hyper, it's because you've got the highest amount of glucose. Okay, so high glucose, and this is what people tend to use in recovery. So as soon as they are finishing, say for example a marathon, a 10k race, they will have a hypertonic drink which has the highest glucose levels, and it really helps resynthesize or replenish or reconvert glycogen and glucose when we finish exercise. So there are 3 drinks. That's what you need to know about. You need to make sure you know the difference between hypo, iso, and hypertonic drinks. Okay, right. So if we go on from here then, what we're looking at next, disadvantages. Now, if you do not follow these hydration rules, you do not make sure you drink water alongside the 3 drinks mentioned there, it causes the negative impacts of dehydration. So dehydration, as we put up here, will lead to the following: decreased blood plasma volume, increased heart rate due to cardiovascular drift, and also it will lead to muscle cramps and fatigue because of the imbalance of glucose in our blood. Okay, so muscle cramps and fatigue there. And then finally, I'm sure you'll be aware of this, but in terms of being hydrated, obviously there is nothing illegal about this. So what illegal, and if you could just change that, but I'm going to take that off. So it's for aerobic athletes, obviously, that you would use these for. Okay, so that is that. Hopefully everyone is okay with that. Good notes, multiple, numerous questions, please, to make sure you are itemizing your knowledge. Okay, thanks very much.